All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist. And today I have a very special presentation for all of you. I have one of my very good friends, Kyla Bruff, Dr. Kyla Bruff, who's professor at Carleton University, who will be talking about Theodor Adorno. So Kyla Bruff is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Carleton University in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Bruff's area of expertise is in classical German philosophy, critical theory in the 20th century, and also 20th century French philosophy, social and political philosophy, existentialism, German Romanticism. Much of Dr. Bruff's research investigates the metaphysical commitments and historical roots of contemporary ideological orientations. She's currently focusing on different understandings of nature in critical theory tradition and their potential implications for how we think about the ecological crisis. One of Dr. Bruff's ongoing projects develops a critical analysis of populism out of the work of Theodor W. Adorno. She has presented multiple papers on Adorno's aesthetics and his views of history and nature, as well as the Schelling-Adorno connection, messianism within the Frankfurt School, and on the work of Max Horkheimer. Her chapter, Schelling and the Frankfurt School, will be published this year in the Palgrave Schelling Handbook, which I'm extremely excited about.
Me too.
She's also the co-editor, and she has additionally taught seminars on the Frankfurt School at Carleton University. Dr. Bruff is also a Schelling expert. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on Schelling's political philosophy, the first standalone monograph on the topic in English, which is super exciting. And additionally, Dr. Bruff is committed to innovative practical approaches to carrying out philosophy in public, as one can see through her many activities as co-director of the ecological NPO For a New Earth, FANE. She's also a translator in French and German texts into English. She has published translations, including the first appearance of Schelling's Late Political Philosophy, lectures 22 to 24, and the presentation of A Purely Rational Philosophy, which I believe is in the Schelling Reader in English. And finally, she's the editor-in-chief of Kabiri, the official journal of the North American Schelling Society, as well as the treasurer and secretary of the North American Schelling Society. So welcome, Kyla, for being here today with me.
Thanks, Chris.
And yes, so welcome again to the series, and I'm so happy that you're participating with me. I was wondering if we could begin by introducing who Theodor W. Adorno is, and perhaps why his philosophy or thought matters for contemporary philosophy or contemporary thought today.
Sure. Thanks so much. And again, it's really a privilege to be here. I'm super happy to be doing this. And I think that what you've managed to do online through your YouTube channel is incredible. So I'm happy that you've made all of this knowledge and these thinkers, available and known to people all over the world. So it's great. And hello to anybody listening to this or seeing this. So in terms of who Adorno is, okay, so Theodor W. Adorno, obviously a 20th century German philosopher, sociologist, musicologist, culture critic. I could keep listing sort of ways we could describe him, but he's associated with the Frankfurt School tradition and of course the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. And so all of those monikers kind of point to the fact that Adorno's work is unique insofar as it deals with, at the same time, metaphysical, social, and cultural issues, all within a framework that I think you could describe in constant dialogue with major figures in the history of philosophy. So that being said, I think, popularly, Adorno is probably most known for his criticisms of consumer culture and the entertainment industry, so especially in the American context. In terms of why his thinking is still relevant and important, well, I think there are two major questions that make him so, or that kind of captivate people that he deals with. So the first one is, why does human-caused unnecessary suffering persist despite the fact that we have the means to eliminate it. And you could consider those means in different ways. And indeed Adorno with his co-author Horkheimer does. So you could consider those means to be technological means, right? You could ask yourself, why do we continue to perpetuate more warfare when we have technological means that could actually be put to the use of improving society and eliminating suffering? You could think of those means with regards to knowledge. So we all know that we have so much factual and scientific and expert knowledge out there now, but a lot of it is not actually being used to good ends, right? To ends for a better society or less suffering. And that has a lot of relevance, I think, for the ecological crisis. Perhaps most famously in the Dialectic of Enlightenment with Horkheimer, I think Adorno conceives of these means through reason. So the fact that we can reason and rationalize was supposed to, on the Enlightenment account, set us free. And then very famously, again, Adorno and Horkheimer say, then why have we descended into barbarism? And why have we not been liberated through the promises of the delivery of a kind of better society through reason? So I think that's the first kind of question that makes them interesting and relevant. The second one, and that's, again, probably more of a popular question, is with regards to the entertainment and culture industry. So why do we spend our free time being willfully distracted by entertainment through, for example, you can update Adorno in this regard, social media or TV or even YouTube, not your channel, Chris, where there's so much inequality and exploitation in society. So why are we allowing ourselves to be distracted when there's so much work to be done out there? And moreover, this distraction is not innocent, right? This distraction and the way that we consume entertainment, and I think, how many ads we willfully, voluntarily consume through Instagram is a good example of this. So we know this type of entertainment actually intellectually dampens us, and it makes us complicit, and I would venture to say even active, in generating profit for big companies who further then contribute to wealth inequality. And so we can think of even Twitter use in this regard. All of us kind of work for Twitter, right? We are the content. We are generating content that we don't financially benefit from. And therefore, in a way, if we're criticizing Elon Musk and using Twitter, we're kind of performing a sort of contradiction, or sorry, X now, insofar as we're contributing again to wealth inequality and to a wrong society, Adorno would say. So those are the two questions I think that can act as an entry point into Adorno and bring somebody who maybe hasn't read Adorno to decide they want to read him. And if you're interested in those things, I would recommend starting with the culture industry essay in the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer. And so there are many other themes and topics that make Adorno relevant for contemporary thought. You mentioned some of them in your very generous intro to my work, because I've written on some of those, just a handful, but, nature, aesthetics, metaphysics. He encourages us to think about metaphysics in a dialectical way, but in a historical context to articulate maybe how things could be different, why they're not different, what we could conceivably expect to be different, which in Adorno's descriptions usually isn't much. There are little glimmers of hope, but he's a notorious pessimist, as you can kind of see on the poster. But in any case, he kind of helps us perform this diagnosis as to why things are not different and what precisely is wrong. But without getting too much into that for the moment, I think those two pressing questions I raised can offer people a way into his thought. And the answer, or the kind of way Adorno responds to a lot of these questions isn't in relation to the types of relationships and type of society that he sees as being produced by late capitalism. And I don't think I even need to say that, it's kind of obvious for Adorno that it's not good. The types of relationships and the type of society, in a word, they're alienated ones, or ones in which people experience a dampening of experience and extreme alienation from themselves, from nature, and from their societies or communities. And Adorno, I think, prompts us to relentlessly critique and reject that type of sort of social and economic configuration. And in a word, you could say, prompts us to reject the world as it is, or the status quo.
Well, I think you did a really great job of not only just introducing who Theodor Adorno is, but you really nicely highlighted a lot of things that are a lot of entryways that students or even scholars can enter in. I love the poster behind you.
It says Adorno
that,
is not impressed.
that you brought up perfectly as you were discussing Adorno. So I think thank you so much for that great kind of like nice, robust answer. So just some of my videos, I know famously Heidegger stated that, a biography on a philosopher is not important, Aristotle lived and died. But I think when we learn about a biography or we learn about a specific thinker, they're an actual living being, in this world of ours, it kind of, it brings flesh to their bones. So I was wondering perhaps if you could briefly give a biographical account of Adorno's life. So it doesn't have to be exhaustive or too in-depth, just maybe kind of highlighting the main points of his life.
Sure, thanks. I was a bit worried when you brought up Heidegger there because, of course, as a former member of the Nazi Party, Adorno had a lot of qualms with Heidegger, and there's a lot of scholarship out there trying to ascertain to what extent parallels can be made with Heidegger, even though, Bowie does this fantastically, for example, even though Adorno really didn't appreciate him. So I'm glad that we don't need to have that discussion because it's a really, really complicated one, but I am flagging it for anybody who wants to look up maybe Bowie's work on that. But the biographical account, sure. And I do think in Adorno's case, his biography is extremely important, not in the least because of his sort of mixed heritage in terms of Jewish and Christian, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also, of course, his experience of the Second World War and exile and so on. So I'll give a brief summary of some of those points. So Adorno wasn't actually born Adorno. He wasn't born Theodor Adorno. He was born Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrund in Frankfurt am Main in 1903. So Wiesengrund being the last name of his father, who was a wine merchant of assimilated Jewish heritage, and he had converted then later to Protestantism. And his mother was a classical singer of Corsican heritage, and she was a Catholic. So he has this mixed background, which I don't think is irrelevant, as I mentioned. Adorno is also well known for having been a musical prodigy as a child, and he excelled in music, perhaps taking after his mother, especially piano from a young age. And he began studying music actually in gymnasium, so his first studies were in music. And again, this is not irrelevant because of all of Adorno's discussion of music and, of course, of discordance and of all kinds of different like aesthetic issues that touch on music and his background. And you can see if you go to the Institute for Social Research, and props to my friend Tobias Heinze on this because he showed me, you can actually see Adorno's scores where he sat and listened to Schoenberg or whatever. And so he owned the scores, and he would sit there and listen to the sort of performances and annotate and follow the scores. So it's super interesting that he has this musical background, and it's important. And he made a shift then to philosophy at a young age as well after studying music. And the story of how he shifted to philosophy is pretty interesting. The legend goes, it came from him reading the Critique of Pure Reason with his friend Siegfried Kracauer, the literary editor of the Frankfurter Zeitung. And apparently they were reading it on Saturdays, and it just kind of at least contributed to his decision to sort of switch over into philosophy. And it's important to note that then in those early years, in the 20s, of course, Adorno was reading and in contact with many other important thinkers like Benjamin, is reading also Ernst Bloch, Bertolt Brecht, and his wife-to-be, she also was involved in these sort of circles, so Gretel Adorno, which is interesting. And she has some fascinating correspondence with Benjamin, actually. So he was in this kind of constellation of thinkers in the 1920s, and he says some really interesting things about Bloch as well, and the spirit of utopia. So he writes something like, I think Bloch was the one who showed me how to think about transcendence. Of course, that's not a verbatim quote, but he is very sort of direct about the influence Bloch had on his thinking, even though Bloch was too optimistic in the end for somebody like Adorno, who is notoriously unimpressed. But yes, so those are the 20s. In the 30s, early 30s, Adorno writes a Habilitationsschrift on Kierkegaard's aesthetics, actually. And for those of us interested in the Schelling-Adorno connection, perhaps you too, Chris, I assume, it's interesting to know that it was written under Paul Tillich's supervision. So, of course, a famous Christian socialist. And then that same year, Adorno joined the Institute for Social Research. And of course, I've mentioned it a few times, that was an institute committed, it is an institute committed to social critique from the points of view of Marxism, socialism, labor movement, and so on. So it's still there in Frankfurt and moved to the US. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So in the early 30s, Adorno unfortunately lost the right to teach, primarily due to his Jewish background, and went into exile. It's well known he then immigrated to Oxford, later to New York, and also Los Angeles. And after he was expelled from Germany, that's when he became Adorno. So that's when he made his last name his middle name. And of course, Adorno is his mother's maiden name. And again, there are some stories out there about how his mother was always proud of her heritage and was like happy that he would adopt a name like that, or that he would change it. I think she wanted it to be hyphenated, but don't quote me. So again, as I just mentioned, the Institute for Social Research also moved to Frankfurt, moved from Frankfurt, sorry, to first Geneva and then New York City in 1933. And so when the Institute for Social Research was there, of course, Adorno remained associated with it. And the institution itself was sort of part of Columbia University at that time in 1935. So 33 to Geneva, 35 to New York. And in 1937, after a very long time together, Adorno married Gretel Adorno, as I had just mentioned, and he knew her for a long time through his connections, his father's business connections actually first, and then through those, as I said, mutual overlapping intellectual circles. So in 1944, he co-authored The Dialectic of Enlightenment with Max Horkheimer, and this may be their most known text, in which they critically examine the dialectic of enlightenment and myth, and the way that enlightenment actually hasn't, as I have previously mentioned, delivered its promises of liberation. And instead, reason has become a tool of domination and subjugation. And we see this all the time in, the drive to dominate nature and the drive to dominate others. And how that is often executed through rational means. So that was written while Adorno was in exile in the US. And during that time, he also wrote the 153 aphorisms and short essays that compose Minima Moralia. At the same time, in this period in exile, he completed a really interesting study. I don't know if you heard of it, but the study on the authoritarian personality. So he wrote this book, it was published in 1950, The Authoritarian Personality, with some colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley. And it's interesting because the colleagues with whom he wrote it, I think they're primarily psychologists. And this was kind of an approach or a work in social psychology. And believe it or not, I don't know, again, if you know this detail either about me, Chris, but I was a high school teacher before I was a philosophy professor. And in high school, the moment where I got to regain some of my genuine deep identity, I suppose, was the day when I was teaching AP, or I guess they call it A-level in the UK, psychology, and got to do 1 to 2 days, I think it was, on Adorno's authoritarian personality. So it's interesting to know that still in the British school system, they learn Adorno and they learn this. This is the main thing that they learn in the psychology course for A-levels in the UK, that Adorno and his colleagues came up with an F scale, or a fascist scale, which was a set of criteria according to which one could sort of suss out or define a fascist or an authoritarian personality. Work, of course, also widely criticized, but important enough for the UK kids to still learn that text, or that kind of approach in the questionnaire. And I think you can even take the questionnaire still online. And I think that I instructed the kids to do that just to see how it comes out without, asking for any disclosure of results. It's not my business. Anyway, okay, I'm almost done. Adorno returns to Frankfurt in 1949, where he, Horkheimer, and Friedrich Pollock reopened the Institute for Social Research, again, back in Frankfurt. And that's reopened in 1951, the same year Minima Moralia is published. Then in 1966, Adorno's famous text, of course, Negative Dialectics, is published. Just a few years later, he dies in his sleep in 1969. And right after that, aesthetic theory is published posthumously. And so both of those texts, of course, negative dialectic and aesthetic theory, continue to be widely influential today.
Well, not only did I get to learn about Adorno's life, I got to learn about something. I also got to learn about your life as well too. So that was nice. That was a nice Easter egg there. I enjoyed that.
Shout out to all of my UK fellow teachers. That was an interesting time. Yeah.
Shout out, yes. No, but I should definitely put that test during the in the the bio part of the video, the write-up of the video. I can't speak today. And see all the people that view the video and see what their score is or whatever, or have them take the test or anything. But thank you so much for that really, really rich navigating us through all of Adorno's life. I think you did. That was fantastic. You really brought Adorno to life. So, in your opinion, how would you describe Adorno's main philosophical influences, and how do you think these so-called or said influences have influenced his work?
Thanks. So that's a question that's going to demand a rich answer, because Adorno has a load of philosophical influences and is at all times deeply steeped in the history of philosophy, but also, as I mentioned, in music and aesthetics and psychoanalysis and so on. So I'll try my best to give a good overview. First of all, I mean, I don't know if you want to call Max Horkheimer an influence. I mean, of course, he was influential, but in a very mutually influential way. So I think as his close collaborator, coworker, and friend who knew him almost his entire life, from his early days, in university to, the death, it was like, Horkheimer knew him very well and was his intellectual interlocutor and co-author and so on. So that is an important detail. And I think we'll talk a little more about Horkheimer in a moment. But putting Horkheimer in his own kind of category, I think we can say that none of Adorno's influences are appropriated or digested by Adorno uncritically. So everybody I'm going to list should be thought of as in critical dialogue with Adorno, because he really is in conversation with these thinkers. And in a pure Adorno fashion, he never wholeheartedly endorses or fully rejects any of their positions. And I think the far-reaching domains of these philosophical influences do show, again, how rich Adorno's thought really is and how many kind of interrelated disciplines it touches on at the same time. So when thinking about his influences, I think it's best to kind of categorize them to kind of keep straight what's happening where. And at first I was thinking, well, there's the category of, classical German idealist sort of influences, and then there's kind of psychoanalysis. But that's even too simplistic, because Marx, of course, stands kind of at the intersection of the classical German thinkers influencing Adorno's metaphysics, but then also in the kind of social and political category of different sort of thinkers that we may group with even, the influence from Lukács. So it's a bit challenging to typify all this because of figures like him who straddle multiple sort of categories. But in any case, we can say that Adorno has a variety of influences in metaphysics, then metaphysics moving into the political and the social, in psychoanalysis, and I may get in trouble for saying this one, but I believe it, in theology or messianism and like utopian thinking, and also in aesthetics. So in metaphysics, we find, as I said, the sort of classical German thinkers, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche in particular, but also Marx and the historical materialism. Then moving into political science, we really get Marx, and also Marx through Lukács. Then in psychoanalysis, the big one is Freud, of course. Theology, we find Gershom Scholem, which is a very fascinating interlocutor of Adorno's. There's a bunch of letters and correspondence between the two of them. I'll speak about it in a second. And Ernst Bloch. And then in aesthetics, we have all kinds of different influences coming in. So Kant, Walter Benjamin, and more, including Schoenberg. I think epistemology deploys a lot, I guess, of Kantian insights that you may see to be epistemological in his understanding of metaphysics, especially the limits of reason and the failure of our concepts to adequately describe the world or ever actually achieve a satisfactory picture of the real as it is. And of course, this might lead one immediately to think like, okay, I can map Adorno easily onto a thinker of, or critical thinker of the phenomenal in relation to the noumenal. Not so. So Adorno makes things even more complicated by criticizing that separation between the noumenal and the phenomenal in Kant, and in particular, the separation of transcendental conditions from reality. So that brings us nicely into why he really needs Hegel, right? He really needs Hegel and Hegel's intertwined approach to seeing, thinking and being, or thinking and reality through dialectics. So I think the single most important influence on Adorno is Hegel's dialectics, even though it's, again, a critical appropriation of Hegel's dialectics. And this is because of the intense importance of determinate negation and contradiction in how Adorno conceives of everything, especially the destabilization of concepts, which I'll talk about again in a moment. But in any case, it's not just dialectics, of course, that Adorno takes from Hegel. It's dialectics in context and dialectics in relation to human experience. So for Adorno, Hegel's understanding of the human being as the human being thinks and experiences life right now can only be pursued through a true analysis and attempt to understand their social and political context, and also human beings' interactions with each other. So that's why you can see then Marx comes in, right? And the whole analysis of society and of people in society as alienated from one another and their communities through like the principle of exchange, for example, and commodification and, unjust relations. It brings Marx into that kind of Hegelian framework. And of course, Adorno reads Marx very much through a Hegelian lens. So there's a criticism of this complete autonomy of the subject, which can lead to some confusion, I think, sometimes when reading Adorno, because it seems at times he really values individual experience and like the individual seems inalienable to Adorno. But then he'll always jump back into saying, do not think there is some ego that's just separated from the rest of society, or some like that your experience is so unique in all of its aspects. Indeed, what I think Adorno's in search of is precisely that tiny kernel of experience. You may even link it to his concept of metaphysical experience, that isn't the total sum of all social relations, knowing that most of our experience is. Most of our experience is mediated by society, and thereby also through capitalism and through those relationships that are cemented or even reified in the society. So that's, I think, how we get from kind of Hegel to Marx in the metaphysical domain. And of course, Adorno also shares Hegel's view of philosophy as located in history or historical enterprise, and that includes what philosophy reveals. And, again, I can talk about that a bit later if you like, but what philosophy reveals is a little different for Adorno than for Hegel, insofar as, Adorno criticizes absolute knowledge. But nevertheless, what philosophy can reveal as truth at a given moment is always historically contingent. And I think that they have that in common. And finally, in the metaphysical domain, I mentioned Nietzsche real quick. We don't really have a lot of time to go into that, I don't think. And you can find Nietzsche all over the Dialectic of Enlightenment, for example. But some basic points would be the criticism of existing norms, right, and values, and especially like the inheritance of like sort of pre-given or dogmatic values, the pervasiveness of power, genealogical sort of method in understanding history. And Nietzsche is kind of a link that you may find even between Adorno and Foucault. So if some of that is sounding like it overlaps with Foucault, you can look up Deborah Cook's excellent work on that connection. I already mentioned a little bit about Marx, and if we go from the metaphysical to the social political, we find Marx right there, as I mentioned, and then also Georgi Lukács. So Adorno, of course, to put it very simply, adopted Marx's criticism of capitalism, right? Focusing on economic relations as primary, and how economic structures and relations influence society, including like the way that we think and our culture and how we relate to one another. And I think this is really important to note that, for all of his criticisms also of Marx, especially the concept of class, notions of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie as insufficient for describing the complexity of class relations nowadays. So as much as we have those criticisms, it's really important to see that Adorno maintains also that economic relations are primary, and that economic disparity is like really where we should start to dig in if we want to understand contemporary culture. And so in relation to that, I think two concepts from Marx that we find to be particularly influential for Adorno are commodity fetishism and alienation. So in a word, I mean, commodity fetishism is when things become reduced to their exchange value, or things, especially like Adorno is concerned intensely with artworks and cultural products, they become valued only in relation to other things and to labor hours, and not in relation to what they actually are, our experience of them, or even our use. So Adorno criticizes that loss of sort of use value as well. And in that context of art and cultural products, Adorno really thinks our capacity to appreciate a work of art, for example, is just the capacity, like our ability to have a rich experience of something cultural, is diminished by its status as a commodity that can be bought and sold. So when we have art around in our houses, we know the worth of the art, and we don't necessarily engage with the art in a way that would be an experience that would dislodge a little bit of the everyday, or that would allow us to, think differently, or I don't know, enrich ourselves. That capacity overall for Adorno has become sort of dampened in this kind of consumer exchange society. So in relation to this, for Adorno, like Marx, we are, of course, alienated. And that's the second big concept I mentioned. So alienated from the products of our work, alienated from culture, alienated from each other. And Adorno kind of makes a lot of this concept of alienation and interprets it a bit broader than Marx to describe most of the way that we experience the world, nature, society. And really interestingly, even how we kind of experience ourselves. And that's a challenge to think about. How could I be alienated from myself? Well, that goes back to what I mentioned a minute ago about that sort of irreducible, like individual experience, or like excess, you might call it, that we have to try to recover in a world where we just seem to be totally socially determined. So Adorno really plays with that. And I think that, the more that we don't think that that's possible, a genuine experience is not possible, then the more we might see ourselves as alienated from our inner nature. And this could also mean alienated from desires, right? So in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer write a lot about that, about like the drives and desires that we may have, but that we are alienated from, or that we don't admit about ourselves. Instead, we repress it and project it. But that's another topic. In any case, this alienation happens pretty ubiquitously, and it happens with regards to, as I said, many different things, including art and nature. And then, I mean, I don't have time to go into Adorno's critical reading of Lukács. You can read some of Ian MacDonald's fantastic work if you want to read about that in English. But in a word, I can just say Adorno kind of picks up Lukács's concept of reification, or the process by which social relations are seen to be as inherent properties of things, that hardening of social relations rather than genuine relations between people. So this is, of course, important for Adorno. And at the same time, we see Adorno as very critical of Lukács's appropriation of objective possibility, or his view of what's going to happen in history and the proletariat revolution's role in history. And this is an important theme. It links Adorno to Schelling, actually, in interesting ways, and many other thinkers that span the disciplines of philosophy and theology. For Adorno, there is no reconciliation in the course of history. There is no redemption or achievement or end of history possible through what Adorno would call sort of wrong society. Okay, so the one psychoanalytic influence I mentioned that I would talk about is Freud, right? And insofar as Adorno wanted to understand the psychological mechanisms that produce things like, in particular, anti-Semitism and authoritarianism, he relies on psychoanalysis. And indeed, how he merges some of this with Nietzsche, and in very rare choice positions, even Schelling, is fascinating, because you see him as talking about like I said, desires and drives and, what we might actually want. And part of the reason that we're so unable to achieve it or see it, part of the reason, because there's a lot of reasons for Adorno, is because we've repressed desire. We've repressed childhood memories. Adorno talks a lot about childhood, actually, and about recovering some of the memories of our childhoods and fears. And so again, with Freud, I think we find an influence on the notion of the unconscious, on repression as not so repression in Freud, yes, influential for Adorno, but in a way such that repression is a social phenomenon for Adorno, and then projection. So as I said, with the unconscious, we have a kind of I suppose, repository or domain of repressed desire that affects us then consciously in different ways. And you mentioned in the bio, one of the things I'm working on is an analysis of how Adorno can help us understand populism. And I think this twist on Freud is one way that he's really sort of rich, because the things we've repressed, including forms of emotions, fears, things we don't want to admit about ourselves, insecurities over our financial situations. These can be on Adorno's account. So that's the repression part, is the Freud, but these can be manipulated, right, by cultural and ideological forces in such a way that control is maintained and a kind of configuration of relations of domination and subjugation is then upheld, and then people become, again, docile and complacent, and then we're back in kind of culture industry analyses. But in any case, that repressed desire and manipulation of emotion, especially in relation to fear, is really relevant, in my opinion. And as I said, Adorno's interesting move is to kind of make repression not only an individual psychological sort of phenomenon, but one that is social. So in capitalism, many of our desires on Adorno's account become repressed. And, I've mentioned some of them. And I think another one we could add to the list in terms of what desires are repressed, like, of course, sexuality becomes a big topic in a certain way. But another one is community, right? Like the desire to live in genuine community with one another. And also, the desire to live in unity with nature. Like, why do we not desire these things? And I think that points to, again, part of Adorno's relevance for the ecological crisis. But I really can't emphasize the point enough, because I really believe in its force, right? That, like, if we don't want to go to communal spaces and we want to stay home, or we don't want to have an experience of natural beauty, we really, really should ask ourselves why. What is it about society? And you can start with the most banal points, like the concept of the public and the private or something. And why don't I want to meet others and go out in nature? Well, because I feel comfy at home. Okay, well, what do I do at home? Oh, I watch Netflix and I enjoy my private space, and nobody needs to know that I don't clean up my apartment or something. And then if you start to use an Adornian lens, I think, to deconstruct those statements, they start to look really weird. Like, why are you so afraid of other people judging your space? Why are you so unable to relax in public with others? Why do you need to have entertainment to be able to relax? What are you not doing because you have that kind of entertainment? And I find when I talk to students about this, sometimes they just feel like Adorno just demands too much of us. Like, he's asking too much. Like, I'm supposed to spend my free time like with others and critically thinking and like not like chilling. And I say, like, well, yeah, like that's kind of the deal. But Adorno is not such a hard ass when you consider his analysis of the society in which you're living in, and the quantification of your experience through Marx, or the university system, which is related to capitalism, of course, and like job prospect. Then they start to feel a bit better, because it's like, oh, I'm not fully responsible for being like that, even though I feel bad about being like that, because Adorno is kind of like exposing my desires that are repressed, I suppose, something like that. Anyway, sorry, that was a little tangent, but I just really wanted to make the sort of Freudian psychoanalytic influence here relevant, and like show how important I really think it is. And to get to the final point about the psychoanalytic influence, we could talk a lot about projection. And again, really interesting chapter in the Dialectic of Enlightenment on this. The chapter on anti-Semitism. So here, projection, Adorno sees it as the attributing of one's own unacceptable or undesirable traits, thoughts, and characteristics onto others. So it's typical projection. But this is the way that they analyze anti-Semitism. So Adorno and Horkheimer. And the argument there is that individuals project their fears, insecurities, and negative qualities onto Jewish folks, right? So they write a lot about Jewish people at that time becoming a scapegoat for all kinds of real sources of the accuser's own distress and even anger in society. And then you might ask, well, for Adorno and Horkheimer, what is that anger and distress caused by, or what's the source? Where is it coming from? This feeling of dissatisfaction and insecurity, and that's capitalism, right? So that's the kind of ends up being the answer, that these unjust relationships and these problems and insecurities caused by capitalism, especially wealth disparity in particular, causes people to project and to repress how unhappy and how they are, and how much they truly feel that they can't succeed, and how much resentment that they have for that. And this gives a kind of false sense of unity, because once again, they're alienated and they don't desire to achieve unity in a more healthy way. So there's a unity against a kind of common enemy. And that's the kind of thesis, right? Anti-Semites, or those who endorse fascism in general, tend to project their fear of domination on the ones who supposedly impact or mediate capitalism, or who they can blame for their own like lack of success and happiness in the society. But I can't stress enough again that Adorno, as a social thinker, does not want to reduce social sort of problems and these issues like prejudice, anti-Semitism, discrimination, and so on to just like psychoanalytic factors. Adorno has loads of critiques of psychoanalysis, and one of them is in relation to its focus on the ego and the individual's, treatment or ways to be cured. And Adorno doesn't think that we can be cured from this sort of these socially steep problems. I mean, he thinks maybe we can do good theoretical critical work, but I hate to break it to your listeners that the possibilities that he sees for ways out are very limited. He's a pessimist, and I think and critical analysis and displacement is probably the best that we can do. So to sort of finish this little, I told you it would be a long answer, so sorry about that, but to finish this little overview of influences, I do want to mention the theological, because it very often goes sort of unnoticed or like marginalized. But in relation to this pessimism or this view Adorno has that we cannot deliver right society in wrong, or we cannot achieve reconciliation in a broken world, there really is a messianic current in his thought that at least sort of introduces the possibility of the totally other, and of a state of affairs that is not one of our own, but that would be something like transcendent, or you could even call it a messianic kingdom, but Adorno will not speak in that way. If you want to read more about messianism with Adorno and Horkheimer actually takes much more of a messianic turn. So Horkheimer has a little book, Die Sehnsucht nach dem ganz anderen. I don't think it's translated, The Longing for the Totally Other. And there he kind of speaks a bit more about his messianism. But there are some key thinkers in that constellation that, again, I think, especially in relation to your desire, Chris, to highlight some Jewish thinkers, some key thinkers that are important, right? So Gershom Scholem, the scholar of Kabbalah, and Jewish mysticism, is the big one. And of course, in relation to Gershom Scholem is Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin, of course, being still associated with the Frankfurt School and maybe much closer in a way of an influence for Adorno, but he dies in 1940. And of course, Adorno is very, very heavily criticized for not having done enough to help Benjamin, especially get to the US. And there's that correspondence I mentioned, which you might want to have a look at, between 1939 and 1969 that was published in English just a few years ago. So the correspondence between Scholem and Adorno, where they kind of write incessantly about their mutual concern over Benjamin. So they're really bonded by Benjamin, but then the kind of constellation or kind of myriad of interests that are related to the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism come out. So in this way, I think we can say that maybe it's a marginal in comparison to Hegel, sure, but Gershom Scholem influenced Adorno on Kabbalistic and Messianic ideas. And of course, Messianism demands a kind of view of, first of all, a critical view of the present and a radical transformation of the world that one cannot sort of bring about on one's own or within the society one is in. One requires a messiah, right? But the point is not to say that, oh, Adorno was waiting for the messiah. He's just as critical of theism in all forms as atheism, and that means he's just as open to discussing atheism as he is theism. He shares this with Horkheimer. In any case, it helps us understand where Adorno might see something like redemption, right? It's not in this world. And that messianic current helps us understand this, and why what is demanded in wrong society is nothing less than a total break with the status quo and the current order. But as I said, I don't want to give any like misinformation. Adorno will never affirm or deny the existence even of God or this totally transcendent other. He more gestures towards it, right? So one thing that's just an interesting note with regard to that historical influence is that in 63, Adorno wrote to Scholem that he was deeply engaged in Scholem's 10 unhistorical aphorisms. And here, in those aphorisms, Scholem kind of gives more philosophical reflections on the Kabbalah. And so that's important, and Adorno praised them. And of course, there is the link again over Benjamin. So when Adorno is writing about the unhistorical aphorisms, he's also writing that he appreciates this theoretical affinity to Benjamin, especially the theses on the philosophy of history. And then almost like in return, it seems, Scholem then in turn comments on Adorno's negative dialectics, which pleased Adorno, and especially the recovery of metaphysics seems to have been something Adorno and Scholem mutually sort of appreciated there. So as I said, Scholem was likely influential, I think, in Adorno's sort of deepening interest in Kabbalah and commitment to a vague messianism, and Benjamin too. So again, I know my answer is extremely long. I won't talk about aesthetics. I'll only say that Kant and Benjamin are important influences. Schoenberg's an important influence. And if you want to look into how and why, again, there's a lot of good scholarship on this, but Kant's view of disinterested pleasure, natural beauty, objectivity in art are important. And there are debates you can even read between Benjamin and Adorno on the relation of or the topic of art's liberatory potential and its possible autonomy. So if some of your listeners are into aesthetics, you can look up those things, and they're really interesting for the possible role of aesthetics in social critique and in even considering what a liberated society might be or might look like. So that's it. Sorry.
Well, no, don't apologize. You're here to teach all of us about Adorno, and let me tell you, your students are quite lucky, because not only did you unpack his influences, you went through those influences, how each concept kind of gets reflected through Adorno, but also how he's very critical of them as well too. So you definitely gave a fantastic overview of all of these concepts. So
A
thank
little
you so
long,
much.
so thanks for your
No,
patience.
no. There really is no time. There really is no time slot. It's all of, thank you for being here. I'm happy that you're here to navigate us through this, very complex thinker. So no, I thought that it was a great answer, actually. Wasn't
Good.
too long at all. No worries. You had brought up minimal moralia and those 153 aphorisms.
Mhm.
And so Minimum Moralia, Reflections on a Damaged Life, is a text that reflects on capitalism, mass culture, alienation, commodification, things that you brought up so nicely before. How does Adorno deal with some of these issues? And what do you think Adorno is attempting to show with these reflections?
Okay, so great question. I think if we want to talk about minimum moralia, we first need to remember the context, right, in which Adorno is writing this. So, of course, exile in the United States, and there is the background of Adorno reflecting on and being absolutely horrified by the Holocaust and Auschwitz and what that means with regards to all of the topics that you also brought up, but humanity, the future, enlightenment, society, relation also to consumerism, and like it's just really the background that informs the whole text. So Again, it was written in a similar time to the Dialectic of Enlightenment, so some of the analyses we find in there are pretty close, but as you noted, the form is different. So it's written in that aphoristic form. And I don't think that that's irrelevant because, as you know, the essay form that we find in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, so, different essays kind of as chapters, allows for Adorno and Horkheimer together to really expand on some of their theories, including, for example, the one I just mentioned, the role of projection in anti-Semitism. However, in aphorisms, we find a kind of disjointed, fragmentary set of reflections that embody the way Adorno is also thinking at this time, insofar as no complete treatise would ever be adequate to the damaged life, as he puts it, or to the horror of what is happening, right? And again, this text is really deeply influenced by Adorno's personal experiences of exile and displacement, and some of the things that we were talking about a moment ago, the challenge of thinking about the possible roots of human emancipation in a damaged world. And of course, none of them will be satisfactory. So when we look at minimum moralia, we find a central paradox, which is how to live the good life. Adorno asks this question in a way, when there is no good life, or he says no right life in wrong, right? So keine richtigem im falschen, or there's no possibility of living a good or right life when society is this bad, to put it in really crude terms. So what do we do with that, right? Adorno thinks that the intellectuals in particular that are in exile, like himself, because he's coming out of his personal experience here, are irreparably psychologically and personally damaged, and that there's no true full recovery from that. There's no total vindication of the Holocaust or the horrors that happened. There's no correction, re-education, for example, could only get society so far. There's no making up for what happened in any way. And I think, therefore, Adorno can't say that living a truly good life is possible. However, he can give us indications of what we can do. And very often with Adorno, what ought to be done is theoretical, or like theoretical work that, as I've kind of said, displaces or interrupts our view of the world as it is. So interrupts ideological or dogmatic fixed pictures of the world, or how we even see the metaphysics or society or fixed understandings. So therefore, in Minimum Moralia, Adorno has a really interesting quote. It's often cited. The splinter in your eye is the best magnifying glass, right? And there's no one interpretation of exactly what Adorno means by that, but we can venture to interpret it. The first thing is, if it sounds familiar to you, to think about where the original prompt may have come from. And I think we can see it as a variation on Matthew 7. So this notion of like the speck, and basically it goes, why do you behold the speck? Or he's, it's written mote in your brother's eye, but do not consider the beam or the log in your own. And the whole point there is that there's kind of a hypocrisy. And the verse continues, take the log out of your own eye, and then you're going to be able to see clearly to take the log out of your brother's. And Adorno kind of has this view, or take the mote out of your brother's. And Adorno kind of has this view of, we're not getting the log out of our eye. Like the mote is staying in the eye of everybody, because irritation and distortion is permanent. There's no seeing clearly. The second we think we see things clearly is when we are kind of like blinding ourselves to, you can use a very Adornian term and say non-identical, but even to the horrors that are committed in the name of capitalism, if you want to make it really tangible. So we are always irritated, and our vision should be distorted, because it's only in the distortion. So the splinter in your eye, especially if it's from a magnifying glass, you think the shard of glass in your eye is that which displaces the picture of a static reality where maybe things seem okay on the first look. I don't know if that's how you experience the world. In any case, if it is, you should pay attention to the sort of problems in that irritation to see what is wrong and what could be different, or what should be different maybe. And the idea being, if things seem a little too clear, then we should be suspicious. And enlarging what is as it is to try to understand it better is not the way. It's like not the epistemological method, if you will. So the fragment of glass or the splinter distorts what's given, and that distortion can help us glimpse the non-identical. And the non-identical for Adorno, and maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. I don't know if you want to talk about negative dialectics, but the non-identical is the gap between the concepts or thought, right, and the whole of reality, or it's that incommensurability between concepts and the real. And so we also have some links to Schelling in that regard. In any case, the distortion helps us see a little more of the non-identical. And it also shows us through the suffering, because you imagine, a shard of glass in your eye is painful and it causes you to suffer, that through our suffering, we actually see more, right, than just taking false society or false reality and blowing it up in a big picture. And this is not to validate suffering. Adorno will never try to justify senseless suffering, but there is a kind of tendency in his thinking to espouse the position that the one who suffers sees the reality a bit more for what it is than the one who's benefiting, right? The one who's wealthy and thinks that all of the conditions in which we live are just peachy, right? That person is not looking closely at false reality. So those are some of the things I really find interesting in Minima Moralia. But in your initial question, you mentioned 4 terms, right? Capitalism, mass culture, alienation, and commodification. And in Minima Moralia, as in the dialectic of enlightenment, we can see these as related. And the way I see them as related is that, of course, capitalism through exchange value, or through this sort of society predicated on exchange relations or reified relations in things, is what produces commodification, right? And we already spoke a bit about that, about commodification, alienation, commodity fetishism, and so on. So the commodification and the alienation is produced in capitalism through this mediation of relations on the basis of exchange value. And this produces sort of standardized cultural products for the purposes of exchange, which include cultural products in the way that we spoke about earlier. And because our lives are organized by these exchange relations, or what Adorno would call the Tauschprinzip, so the principle of exchange, our society is now just an exchange society. And that's what's determining this sort of situation of the things that you mentioned, a problematic mass culture of commodification and alienation. Right, so this is the Tauschgesellschaft, and in this sort of Tauschgesellschaft, we are in this sort of impersonal network of exchange relations mediated by commodities, and this affects everything for Adorno. And Minima Moralia is full of gems. I really encourage you, you can read it the way some people read Aurelius's Meditations, where you read a few of them at a time and see what he's saying. It's an aphorism, book of aphorisms. So with regards to the exchange society, he talks about children and gift giving, right? And he says, basically, we don't even know how to give and receive gifts anymore, because giving and receiving is so intertwined with capitalism and exchange society. So he kind of says that children are skeptical of gift givers. They size up the gift giver mistrustfully, wondering if the gift is a trick. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation, maybe with a parent, some listeners, where you remember being a kid, you're getting a gift, but there's like stakes in the gift, right? Like this is a trick for you to either get you to do something, or to get you to perform something, or I don't know. But Adorno says kids know, they're skeptical of this gift giving, and they're skeptical of the gift giving because exchange society is so ubiquitous and oppressive in a way that it doesn't really seem like genuine gift giving and receiving is possible. And I think in that example, you can see one of the big points of Minima Moralia regarding how our freedom is limited and our scope by exchange society, and how our scope of possible genuine activity and self-expression is reduced. And this is especially true in regards to how we think about other people, right? So we reduce the other, and our relationship to the other is mediated through exchange. And the commodification of culture is just making this worse, because we are consuming these cultural products, and we're doing so in a standardized and sort of homogenized culture factory or culture industry, where everything that is produced is designed to keep us all entertained in the same way, and assure a kind of homogeneity of experience. And there are really interesting and different ways to think about this, right? Like, I don't know, maybe we were all guilty of it, of being in a foreign country and finding a McDonald's or a Starbucks and feeling relieved, right? That's one way that the kind of homogeneity of experience as produced by, or further perpetuated by big corporations, unfortunately brings us into this like domain of familiarity and comfort that we willfully desire. And that desire is exactly the outcome, Adorno says, of living in that kind of exchange commodity-based society where our real desires are repressed. So those are some products, but if you want to talk about more cultural products, you could, I don't want to pick on Taylor Swift, but like, the songs sound the same. There's even an Instagram influencer, maybe we can link that, Chris, who's making fun of the chord progressions of the Taylor Swift songs and the topics. And she's singing over like a standardized chord progression. She's like, and then the third, and she's like just singing the formula to create a Taylor Swift song. And she got a lot of hate for it, but went viral for it because it was showing that the products are so standardized and they're so repeatable that we come to desire the dampening of our own experience. We come to desire that which is predictable and that which is easily consumable, that which we can show others, and it's homogeneity insofar as it's everything is the same. And anyway, that's another example. The topics of the pop songs, they're all about the same kind of romantic, emotional based love. Just these kind of products that assure that we all kind of continue to have a weaker experience of life than that would be possible in a different sort of society is the problem here. So this alienation we experience under late capitalism, in view of some of those things I just mentioned, it's not just an economic alienation or an alienation just from our labor, but it's an alienation that is everywhere, from everything, including personal relations, experiences, creativity, and even self-perception. So I think that's kind of a summary of the relation of those terms that you mentioned. And also you can see there the link with Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, and the way that culture, especially mass culture, composed of the products that I was just describing, serves as this tool, mega tool. The culture industry is a more of an apparatus, a ubiquitous apparatus of capitalist domination. That it just creates these passive consumers conditioned to accept things as they are, conditioned not only to like be okay with the status quo, but to desire it. We want more Taylor Swift songs. We want more songs about love. We want another season of the TV series that we're watching. And this has really damaging social effects. And again, you can see some similarities with Foucault insofar as it promotes conformity, stifles critical thinking, and it ensures that we just stay distracted and like discontently content, like kind of unhappy, but like satisfied with these sort of superficial pleasures that are on offer. And this is us in Adorno's world consenting to our own kind of subjugation and reduction and alienation. Okay, so I talked about a few things already in Minima Moralia with regards to Auschwitz, Holocaust, Adorno's critique of society, and his weak vision of I say weak because it's underdetermined, of a kind of a messianic future. And I think, again, the last point I would just make about that text is that Adorno doesn't, as I mentioned, affirm or deny the existence of the transcendent other or the totally other. But he insists on the importance of metaphysical experience, which is, again, a notoriously difficult term, insofar as Adorno is unclear about exactly what it is, but he has to be unclear about it because it's an experience that he thinks resists generalization, and an experience that kind of, he says, it only survives negatively. He links it to childhood, attempts to recover childhood memories. But what's important is that it may point to this type of experience, if we aim for it, it may point to a world without suffering, and like the ability to kind of experience maybe a glimpse of that. And so, I mean, in conclusion to that question, if we don't know what to do with Adorno, because Adorno is so skeptical about praxis, especially uncritical praxis, and by uncritical, I mean like sort of one path directions to the better society. He'll never endorse anything like that. He's got issues with revolutions. He's got issues with the student protest movements in Germany in the 60s. You know, it can be very challenging to decide what to do with Adorno. Okay, we have all this political and social critique, but what do we do? Well, again, with Adorno, I think what we have to do is focus on what we see through that splinter in our eye that points to something, a glimpse of the right in wrong, right? In the context of the wrong, that's always going to be wrong. And so we have this really beautiful quote from Minima Moralia. It's right at the end, and it's where you really do see the messianic influence in Adorno, where Adorno says, and I'll just sort of condense it because it's kind of a long quote. He says, perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange the world, that reveal it to be as indignant and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. So this is the conclusion of the book, and I mean, conclusion in an aphoristic sense. And I think it kind of, again, it sheds light retrospectively on everything he said, and it kind of points to more light being shed on how wrong things are in a sort of future that is to come, but we don't know if it's ever going to come. So keep thinking, keep reflecting, and keep fashioning critical perspectives that displace, the status quo.
Well, that was a terrific answer, and I think you did a really good job of disclosing this text for us. I actually mixed up some of my questions. I was going to ask you about negative dialectics. So I guess my last question will be on negative dialectics. But yes, no, thank you so much for that really rich answer and taking us through. You're doing a really good job of kind of navigating us through a very complex thinker.
Mm-hmm.
So my final question for you, again, thank you so much for your time. Adorno wrote an important text titled Negative Dialectics. What exactly does Adorno mean by negative dialectics?
Okay, thanks for that. Negative dialectics is Adorno's critical appropriation of Hegel's dialectics, in a word. So it's Hegelian dialectics without reconciliation, if you wanted it in a nutshell. And it's Adorno's sort of appropriation of the concept of determinate negation, but again, without what we might say is the Aufhebung or the sublation or the reconciliation. So just to break it down for your listeners that maybe not all of them are familiar with Hegelian dialectics, in traditional Hegelian dialectics, concepts, knowledge, history, even society, are determined through this process, dialectical process, where their existing state or whatever we see as static about them is negated. That all sounds fine for Adorno, right? Negated, contradiction is kind of exposed. Adorno's there, but here's the negative moment, right? For Hegel at that point, a higher state is achieved. So we use the term sublation, or Hegel says Aufhebung in German, Aufhebung meaning canceling and preserving. So wherever the next concept is, wherever the next moment in history is, wherever the next form of even like the law in society is, it's at a state that's a progression from the previous because it's been aufgehoben, which means what was in the previous was canceled and preserved in the next. I remember my first teacher making a very big deal about canceling and preserving. Tony Stafford from Moralia University. She wrote on the board, Aufhebung, canceling and preserving, not the same thing as synthesis, because she really wanted to emphasize that what came before is preserved in this higher state as well. So it's not just a canceling and it's not just a melding together. So this is, how the dialectic keeps moving forward, right? And therefore, there are debates about this, but in any case, we can say there's some progress possible, right? So society progresses, history progresses through sort of newer states that are canceled, or so preserved canceled versions, higher versions of previous states. And, Hegel also, of course, talks about concepts in this way, in the logic, and the sort of self-sublation of concepts insofar as, concepts determine other concepts by not exactly being what they are. And we could get into that. But in a word, in relation to all of those things, Adorno accepts the negation part, but he rejects the higher development part. So dialectics for Adorno, through that first moment, right? The first moment is the negation, and then the second moment is the sublation, right? Through the first moment, dialectics is able to challenge or to expose the contradictions inherent in concepts and that Adorno thinks are inherent in the relation of concepts to the world, but they bring further negativity, basically more problems, more perspectives, more concepts that are trying to kind of like describe the real but never actually achieve that goal. And then that negativity brings Adorno to say things like truth is actually found in the non-identical, not the identical. And he challenges thereby, the adequacy of identity thinking or absolute knowledge of reality or any sort of clear metaphysical picture of the world. And I know some of that it can be a little jargony, but basically the whole emphasis on the terms of identity and non-identity comes from the idea that most thinking is identity thinking, right? We identify, we map, we call things names, and we identify things. And the non-identical is precisely, as I said, that which is not or identified or failing to be identified, or the gap in between reality and that identity thinking. And so in this way, Adorno sees dialectics as a method that kind of allows us to negate, destabilize, or challenge existing concepts or thinking, right? Thought as it is. But the moment of reconciliation or progress or higher actuality or even redemption doesn't happen as a logical outcome of that negation. So therefore, I mean, Adorno has these little snappy quips here and there where he describes things very concisely. And regarding negative dialectics, he does indeed have one of these, where he explicitly states that dialectics for him is simply the, quote, consistent consciousness of non-identity. And so we're talking about, what does that mean? Consistent consciousness or awareness of non-identity. Well, it means that negative dialectics exposes this gap and these contradictions between thought and reality, or between concepts and objects. And here we get again some of this negativity, right? Insofar as thought is always inadequate, incommensurable, right? It's never commensurate to the object. And therefore we find one of Adorno's big theses here in negative dialectics, or at this point, which is this Vorrang des Objekts, right? The priority of the object, or priority of objects over subjects, meaning that objects and their inherent qualities take precedence over any sort of subjective or conceptual interpretations. So again, Adorno believes that objects cannot fully be known in thought or through our sort of epistemological methods. And therefore, we should be honoring that and honoring their non-identity or difference from precisely our concepts and thought, despite the fact that we need thought and concepts to access them in the way we do. So this is not some esoteric metaphysics. It's a way of Adorno saying, yes, the world is, as we experience it, is socially and conceptually mediated always. However, that is always also changing in relation to the fact that our concepts and our society never is fully commensurate with reality. So thought inherently strives to identify everything, but through this dialectic or negative dialectics, thought itself can reveal its own failures. Right? Thought itself, we can think contradiction. And this is a destabilization process where existing concepts and categories are shown to be inadequate, even though they still have a function and even though they still have a value. They are, especially if they're stable, they are not exactly what they are describing, right? There's that non-identical, that gap, and this highlights that irreducibility of reality to any conceptual frameworks. So then, as I said, the truth is what is revealed in non-identity for Adorno, rather than what is revealed through identity itself or through our positive concepts. So truth almost becomes a negative concept. It's somewhat maybe counterintuitive, but the point there being, there's no stable set of facts or picture of the world that is objectively for all time true. And by looking at why and how that is the case, we can reveal more sort of truth in the non-identical, is kind of the point. And that's how we, or where we sort of find this metaphysical basis of Adorno's rejection of reconciliation and redemption and progress in history, and his commitment rather to tension. And I see that also as Schellingian, right? It's the tension that sustains the possibilities of thinking and of confronting contradiction, rather than the process of the unfolding negation and sort of Aufhebung or reconciliation or sublation. And so that's why it's negative, and it's a very complicated sort of text, but I hope that gives you the basis.
No, I think you covered all the bases there. I think you did a really good job of going through that text and telling us what negative dialectics are and how they're employed by Adorno. So I think you did fantastic, actually. I want to thank you so much for being here. One last really fast question, actually. Is there anything that you're currently working on right now that's coming out that you can maybe highlight or something? You have a paper, you have a text coming out, you have a project coming out.
Well, I think you mentioned it all in the bio. So the Palgrave Schelling Handbook is coming out with the article on Schelling in the Frankfurt School. We're also currently working on Adorno's concept of natural beauty and its relevance for the ecological crisis, and also how it may help us think about why nature is more than the social, and why nature can't be reduced to the social, and what's the relation to our thinking of nature to transcendence. And as I mentioned on this kind of concept, we find the influence of Kant too. So it's really interesting, but that's work in its very sort of infantile stages. And yes, of course, I'm revising my book on Schelling's political philosophy. So that's a longer project, but eventually, Chris, it will see the light of day.
When it does see the light of day, I hope you will come back here and let's discuss it. Let's talk about it, because I'm a really big fan of your work and your scholarship. And thank you so much for being here and being part of this series.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. And as I said, I really appreciate everything you've done with your channel and your platform. And so thanks again for having me on. It was a real honor to talk about Adorno with you.
Thank you so much. All right.